National Signing Day, the first Wednesday of February, used to be everything in college football recruiting and signing that next wave of players. Not anymore, but still important to many programs that are looking for that final piece or two or three or four. Oklahoma in that situation. We have seen a trend over college football that makes total sense that those teams, those programs that had a transition of coaches have more work to do during this February signing day than the established coaches across the country. We're talking Oklahoma, of course, with all of you for the next 60 minutes plus. We got Jason Ray on the line, as we always do, 43 consecutive shows. Jason has made this happen. Catch his work at Last Word on College Football. Hey, Jason, happy National Signing Day, or whatever it's worth anymore.
Happy National Signing Day to you. It's obviously it's not as big as the early signing period, but there's still, with Oklahoma having a little bit of a late start on some things, I think Oklahoma's going to be in a position to sign a few more than they typically have during this late signing period today. So, good.
So, one player that at various times during his recruitment has been assumed by many to be an Oklahoma signee, but then there have been other times in which it appeared as though he was weighing his options. So Gentry Williams does make that commitment official and signs with OU.
Yeah, no, I think to your point, Mark, very, very much expected. I think when you looked at a kid like this, he was very, very high on Oklahoma throughout the years. He's been a kid that's been very pro staying in the state of Oklahoma. So I think Oklahoma always had a leg up from that perspective. I think to your point, there was some period where even before Lincoln moved on to USC, there was some thoughts that USC was in the mix for him as well. And so, a lot of people were a little bit worried given the fact that he didn't sign in the early signing period. But I think it was really, as we've mentioned a couple of times, Mark, I think it was really just him just having a level of comfortability with the new defensive staff that was coming into Norman. So had a couple of in-home visits, and then as early as soon as last week, really kind of reconfirmed that commitment to Oklahoma. So no surprise today, but obviously he's the highest ranked, according to 247 composite right now. At this point, he's the highest ranked Oklahoma signee at this point. So he's going to be in an area where he'll be able to compete immediately for either for a starting job or for a role within the secondary, wherever they put him. He can. He's ranked as an athlete, but I think he probably is a secondary player for Oklahoma, cornerback, safety, nickelback, somewhere in that neighborhood. So great to have him for Oklahoma, have him on board, and somebody that they've looked to, and I think it goes to show, Mark, we've talked a lot about the in-state recruiting for not only Oklahoma, but just how important that is across the country for some of these teams. And I think Venables has, and the staff has really showed a renewed focus on in-state kids, and a renewed focus on kids that really want to be here. And certainly Gentry was one of those kids.
Folks, leave your comments and questions. We will get to them here over the next hour. We're here every Wednesday at 12:30 Eastern, 11:30 Central. So OU7 Natties. So understand that what you don't know is that Jason was here on time. He was ready to roll. I had some internet issues. I had to reset the internet, and that takes some time to reboot and reset everything and get everything up and running. So don't make comments about things you don't know about. Okay. Then we've got Big Mac Mullet. How many we thinking today? 4 to 5. It's interesting that you put that 4 to 5 number out there, because that's what Jason said to me before we started to record. So, Jason, with that question, I believe it's up to who's on the fence, who's on the board, and may go Oklahoma's way here in the next day or two.
Yeah, Mark. So I think Oklahoma's got 6 guys that they've really been pushing, really have been in on over the last few weeks. Big Mac is referencing here Devon Campbell, and I think he's been a guy that's probably, from what I understand now, might have been signed with Texas all along, even in the early signing period. But I think he's it's very much been trending that direction over the last few days, over the last week or so. So I think he's a guy that'll end up going to Texas. I think Ahmad Moton is another kid who's a 3-star guy out of the Fort Lauderdale area. At one point, looked like Oklahoma was in a good position for him, but right now, from what I'm seeing and everything I'm hearing, it looks like he's probably headed to Miami. So those are the two that Oklahoma, it looks at this point, have missed out on. However, I think the other 4 that I'm getting ready to mention are Oklahoma's in really, really good position for those. They've got a lot of crystal balls as of late. A lot of predictions, even from Steve Whitfam, for Oklahoma here. So Jamarian Burt, he's a 3-star athlete from Florida. He's a kid that's possibly going to decide on Thursday. So I think it's a little bit of a TBD, but haven't heard anything specifically in terms of when he is going to announce. But he's another athlete, top 30 overall athlete in the country, a little bit further down from a star perspective, but still a guy that the Venables and staff that got in on a little bit late, but a guy that they like. Grayson Halton is an interesting one. He's a kid that has been committed to Oregon for quite some time, decommitted through the coaching change. Oklahoma got in on him. He's even taken a couple of visits to Oklahoma. Then he took another visit to Oregon. Everything still looks good for him. A 4-star defensive lineman, 6'3", 270. A kid from San Diego, California that Oklahoma got in on. That would be a really good get for them. Because, we talked about this a lot, Mark. I think the defensive secondary and then both offense and defensive lines were the areas of improvement from just kind of reloading this roster was exactly what they what Oklahoma needed. So he's a guy that Oklahoma like his chances for the Sooners. Cavante Henry, he's in the, and I should have mentioned Grayson Halton. He is actually going to announce around 4:30 this afternoon / evening. So I think that's something to look forward to later on this afternoon, evening for Grayson Halton. Cavante Henry is a linebacker commitment from Michigan. Been a hard commitment. He's out of California as well. 6'4", 225. He's been a guy, honestly, that has been pretty strong to Michigan for quite some time. However, with some of the changes that's been gone on in the staff for Michigan, McDonald leaving and going to the NFL, the uncertainty around Harbaugh, Oklahoma's really been in a position to take advantage of that. Still very, very strong. A lot of crystal balls on the high end for him. So I think Oklahoma, again, is in a really good position for him, which is an area that Oklahoma's done really, really well at from a recruiting perspective, even before the new staff got in here. But they've been able to solidify that commitment with Oklahoma has Kip Lewis. They have Jaron Kainick along with Kobe McKenzie. So 3 really good linebackers. So if they add him, that linebacker room starts to get a little bit better, even with the loss of Nick Benito and Brian Asamoah. So a lot of good young talent there. And then the last one, R. Mason Thomas, he's a kid that had been previously committed to Iowa State for quite some time. So Oklahoma got in there a little bit later, obviously, and things look good for him. There's been a couple of flip projections this morning as well. So I think he's a guy that Oklahoma looks good on. So I think those 4, Mark, along with Gentry Williams, is something that I think we'll see Oklahoma add about 5 guys through that process. And you never know, Mark. Sometimes there's a surprise commitment that out of left field that no one is really kind of thinking of or talking about. But those are the guys that I think Oklahoma is in a good position for, just in terms of who they will be adding through this late signing period for Oklahoma.
Yeah, once the Jim Harbaugh news broke yesterday, we went live and looking at their recruiting class to see how much potential damage would be there. They actually have everybody signed except Cavante Henry. And just looking at his, I think it's it's reasonable to say, if you've got somebody in that situation that's from that area, that there might be other reasons why they've committed to that school. Maybe they've been a fan, and there's just the location, wanting their family to see the games. But coming from California to Michigan, I got to think that Jim Harbaugh and his staff had a large part to do with that connection and that interest. And now that that's most likely falling apart, that he would be wide open to go elsewhere. Devon Campbell, my goodness, he is the #1 rated interior offensive lineman in the country. So if Texas can at some point field a decent offensive line, I don't know what's going on down there, because
well, they got a really good offensive line coach as well. Came over from I think it's Kyle Flood. I think he's the guy that came over from Alabama. So yeah, no, I agree with you. They've got a lot of talent there. They've just got to be able to do it for sure.
So the guy that currently has the fan base evidently divided. There have been other folks recently, but the most recent seems to be Kamar Wheaton. The talent's obvious. So those people that just side on the talent end of the spectrum say, hey, get the most talented guys. He's a 5-star. Let's go get him. What's going on? And he, of course, had it down to Alabama and Oklahoma for his original selection. Others are seeing the warning signs of immaturity and maybe some other issues that he has.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I wonder, from Oklahoma's perspective, how hard you go after a kid that kind of, kind of left you on the day before, signing day, and things like that. So I've continued to hear no word whatsoever that Oklahoma's actually entertaining going after Kamar Wheaton. Not even any conversations or anything like that that's been happening. From what I do hear, I think he's probably a strong SMU lean at this point. He is a Texas kid, so from all intents and purposes, you would think that he probably stays within this area at this point. So, and it was weird. Like we talked about this last week, Mark, how he, basically didn't inform anyone from Alabama. He just kind of left. He did at least officially a couple of days ago, officially hit the transfer portal. So, yeah, like I said, we'll keep an eye on that, but I still haven't heard anything remotely concrete about even any mutual interest between the two at this point. But I think to back up your point, he was a 5-star talent, one of the best running backs in the country in last year's class. So he's a kid that has all kinds of talent. That he's able to. That he'll be able to provide wherever he goes. But yeah, there's probably a little bit of a mentality question, mental toughness, not from a stability perspective, just looking at that. But yeah, everything I've seen and read and heard and people I've talked to looks like SMU's a big player here.
The way a lot of these student athletes make decisions in regards to how many times they make a decision or a commitment and flip back and forth. And I don't know that anyone's ever run statistics on that. I would think it somewhat fascinating for us to be able to say, okay, so-and-so committed for 2023. This commitment holds 82% of the time. And then you'd have a better gauge of what and each individual is different. But I would be interested to know how many of these long-term commitments hold. I bring that up because the 2023 wide receiver, I lost track of his name. I think it was DeAndre Moore.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
He decommitted from OU. There have been comments made in conversations that I've had with the beat writers and so forth for various programs that say, especially if the connection made is from a long distance. So this is a California kid committing to Oklahoma or Michigan, that you almost would rather just maintain that relationship and have them commit late in the process rather than get an early commitment that you got to hang on to for a long, long period of time. So the 2023 commits, of course, we're looking at a minimum of 10 and a half months that you have to maintain that commitment. And everybody in the world is going to be after that particular player, depending on their status. And so I don't know that I would be necessarily that alarmed with this particular news.
No, I'm not either, Mark. And I think, when we've talked about this a little bit as well, but these kids, I don't really, not that I don't pay attention to it, but I take commitments for the 2023 class, even really right now at this point, with a little bit of a grain of salt, because they got an entire year to change their mind, to be wooed by these other schools and things like that, wherever it might be. So, yeah, no, I'm with you. I don't put a lot of stock into this, commitments or even any decommitments right now, because these 16, 17, 18-year-old kids, they're going to change their minds basically based on the way the wind blows from time to time. So yeah, you'll see those things change. So I don't really get too far in the weeds in terms of just really being that concerned about a commitment decommitting or coming to Oklahoma or wherever until it gets a little bit closer to the signing day.
The Kamar Wheaton situation and his decision also brings something else to mind that appears on the surface to be a difference between, or a possible difference between, Lincoln Riley and Brent Venables. So there's a character component in all of this too. It's not just a matter of let's go get the 22 most talented guys we can find and there you go. Of course, there's positional need and fit and all that sort of thing. But beyond the talent and the skill level on the field, you've got a measure of character that you have to review and evaluate. And that character can display itself in a number of ways in regards to the work ethic. Is that individual going to put in the work? Are they going to put in the time? Are they going to be responsible? Are they going to be somebody that's going to help teammates, that's going to be there for their teammates? Are they going to show up on time? Are they going to, all these things? And then in addition to that, you've got an extension of, does this person, you've got football character with certain guys you may see it talked about in the NFL where maybe they've had some issues off the field. That's not good. That's a whole other category. But from a football standpoint, they've got football character, meaning they'll put in the work and the time and they're there for their teammates, but they got other issues off the field. So then you got to kind of review that, and you take a risk reward viewpoint, and that has to factor into the decision. This kid is this talented, but he's done A, B, and C. Should we proceed with pursuing him? On the surface, I would make the judgment that maybe that's more of a consideration for a Brent Venables than it would be for Lincoln Riley, possibly. And this comes to mind because of various conversations that I've had in recent days regarding certain coaches. And again, there's not necessarily a right or wrong. You can take a very conservative approach, and it's impossible to field a roster of 105 with 85 scholarships with choir boys. That's not going to happen, but you've got to make calculated risks and use your best judgment. And the bigger the talent, the more you're willing typically to take a risk, but it still is a risk, and that all has to be measured. But just on the surface, I may be wrong, but it appears as though that might be under more consideration for Brent Venables than it would have been for Lincoln Riley.
Yeah, no, I think you laid that out very in a very good way, very articulate, just in terms of the difference in the coaching staffs, and I think. And this is not necessarily just a slam on Lincoln Riley, but I think one of the things that you've seen with Venables and the staff is how important and how big integrity is for Venables. And there's been a couple of kids that Oklahoma has been in on from a transfer portal perspective. guys that really came out and talked about how enjoyable a visit was. Even there was a kid, and his name's escaping me, kid that ended up going transferred from Missouri, took a visit to Oklahoma, then actually ended up transferring to LSU. Makai Wingo, that's the kid's name. Took a visit to OU. When he was at OU, he was he was just very glowing about the coaching staff and how down to earth a lot of these coaches are. And I think that's the difference. This is Venables is going to run this more like a, really kind of more like kind of an intimate school, whereas and be part of that, personal relationship with these kids. Whereas I think Riley very much looked at it from a CEO perspective. These are my pawns that I need to be able to do what I need to do to win championships, and the personal relationships weren't quite there. So I think that's going to be something that you're going to see a lot of, kind of moving forward. Mark, is just the enhanced personal relationship that Venables and the staff is gonna have with these kids. And it's like we've talked about from a recruiting perspective. It's been pretty incredible that Oklahoma's still at the position that they are here in 2022. And if they land some of obviously depending on what some of these other guys do, other teams do here in the late signing period, but Oklahoma, if they land these 4 or 5 kids, that they're looking at, they have a potential not only to be in the top 10, but get up to a number 7 or a number 8 situation. And so Venables has a lot of road ahead of him. Hasn't even coached a game at this point, but getting Oklahoma to a 7 or 8 spot, or even anywhere in the top 10, based on kind of the timing and all the decommitments and everything, is just a fantastic first win, if you will, for him. And then we'll just look and see what that looks like in his first year in Norman on the field.
Currently, Texas has 27 commits and Oklahoma 17. So you're going to have a gap in ranking naturally if the classes are somewhat comparable, just from a size standpoint. If you're more concerned with quality, then there still may be a gap. But Texas currently sits at number 5 and Oklahoma at number 10 in the 247 sports rankings. And I just see where some folks they're concerned with Texas, and Texas getting too much talent. Doesn't seem to be a significant difference, though.
No, it doesn't. And I think when you put everything, the transfer portal, such a big part of that, Mark. Sometimes the recruiting rankings can be a little bit jaded from that perspective, because they don't really look at the transfer portal as part of those rankings. So when you put that together, I mean, you almost can look at Oklahoma top 5 class. Oklahoma's got 10 guys that they've added from the transfer portal. So 247 actually has a transfer portal ranking, right, where Oklahoma's number 4 overall right now. USC and Ole Miss are obviously the huge winners from a transfer portal perspective. But I think when you add all of those things up, where Oklahoma's been able to get 10 guys, and then to your point, they've got 17 through the right now, through the 2022 cycle. You've got 27 guys, and then potentially upwards of 31, 32 that Oklahoma will add through this season. So yeah, they've done a phenomenal job in both areas here to get them where they need to be, and which is obviously adding more talent within the team, replacing some of the talent that has left, whether it be through transfers or whether it be through just early departure into the NFL. So I think they've done as good of a job as you could have hoped for, and replenishing some of that talent that they've lost.
Got Jason Ray on the line, as we always do. Last word on college football. He makes the show go, so we appreciate Jason being here each and every week. This is now 43 consecutive weeks of OU Sooners Live. We're here every Wednesday at 12:30 Eastern, 11:30 Central. Keep in mind that sometimes we've got to switch up, not very often, but once in a while based on outside obligations, scheduling conflicts, and so forth. So please subscribe to the channel, hit that bell for the notifications. That way you know when we go live each and every week. Also, you can contribute right here on the Super Chat, or you can hit me up at Venmo, PayPal, or Cash App, MarkRogersTV, Venmo, PayPal, or Cash App. I would just like to know that your contribution's going toward the OU live stream here. So, Jason, you outlined for us the 6 guys that are on the board and the likelihood that they are where the first 2, Campbell and Henry, not so likely to be. I think it was Campbell and Henry. Campbell and
Ahmad Moton is the other
yes,
guy.
Moton.
Yeah.
Ahmad Moton from Florida to be coming to OU, but then the other ones you feel better about. So when you look at those 6, putting that aside and just looking at their sheer talent and ability, and then also positional needs on the team, what would be your priority list of who you would like to see sign?
That's a good question, Mark. I think the defensive lineman would probably be the biggest priority. So some combination there of what we talked about with R. Mason Thomas, with Cavante Henry's the linebacker product. So I think he's a kid that's a really nice to have. But I think Grayson Halton and R. Mason Thomas are probably the two biggest ones I would see from a defensive line perspective, because very much the same conversation that you have with a running back that we've had with a running back. You can almost get to a point where you don't have too many defensive linemen. So I think getting those guys, especially Grayson Halton, he's one of the better defensive linemen in the country, a 4-star guy who's a guy that's really good to have available potentially at this time. So I think I would say starting with the defensive lineman, and then obviously I think your Cavante Henry is probably the next in line there. Even though Oklahoma has some depth at the linebacker position, from what they've got recruiting, I think defensive linemen, just getting the guys that Oklahoma needs in there is going to be really important. So I think I would say start with them, and then kind of move down from there.
Folks, we appreciate it if you would hit the like button. So that doesn't have anything to do necessarily with Jason or myself wanting a bunch of likes. It has everything to do with YouTube. Just the way that it's set up with their algorithms is that if there is a high percentage of likes to a particular video, then they will push that out into the traffic. When you open up YouTube, you get suggested a bunch of videos. Those video preferences are based on both what you've selected in the past, but it's also based on what is trending and what is gaining likes and views. And so they continue to push those videos, and it becomes a matter of momentum. So we would appreciate it if you would. We appreciate that we've got 321 on the line, but thank you for also hitting the like button as well. And it would be great if you would get out there and let people know that we're here every Wednesday at 11:30 Central. Okay. So while we've got it in front of us, well, 2 more topics here. Oklahoma did sign a punter, so we expect the viewer count to double immediately to get in on this discussion. But it is important to get a good punter, and this guy's one of the best.
Yeah. Brady Braun, he's typically punters don't get ranked, but and I'm trying to remember just from the accreditation perspective, there's a service out there that kind of ranks special teams kids. So he was ranked as probably the 3rd best punter in the 2022 cycle. 5-star kid according to that. Obviously, he's not going to be not going to be rated, or definitely not a 5-star from some of the major services like like Rivals or 247. But yeah, no, I think he's a good. So Oklahoma has Michael Turk coming back, one of the best punters in the country, but he's a kid that should be able to really kind of challenge for that starting punting job in 2023, and then obviously be there for support. Josh Pastner, who's another kid that came over from Arizona State as well, will be there as well. So they might be in a position to challenge next year. But yeah, anytime it's not the sexiest commitment, or talking about that most exciting, but yeah, it's something needed. And I think it's one of those things. It's Jay Nunes' first commitment for Oklahoma. So Nunes is a guy who was the Eastern Michigan special teams coordinator. Took a job with Oklahoma off the field as kind of running the special teams for Oklahoma. So he'll be a one. That's one of the things that's been missing for Oklahoma, really just having a dedicated special teams guy. And Oklahoma has done a really just a fantastic job in bolstering their staff off the field. So having him, or having that guy there is going to be great, for Oklahoma. Hopefully for Oklahoma special teams moving forward, and then obviously being in a position to get that kid is going to be great for Oklahoma as well.
And we'll also make a brief comment about, unless we get feedback from the live chat that you would like us to continue, the one guy that's received the most comments by any Oklahoma or former Oklahoma player, certainly here in the last couple of months. So it was official yesterday, made official yesterday, that Caleb Williams has signed with USC. So what was assumed by many all along finally occurred, but he apparently gave a long look to Wisconsin before he made his final decision.
Yeah, we talked a little bit about this week, and just talking to some people, it just felt like such a very odd fit, for Caleb to go to Wisconsin. So, I heard there was a lot of smoke on that, but it was kind of one of those things where I was not going to believe it until I actually saw it situation. So yeah, the thing that I think most of us assumed was going to happen for the last 2 months, or at least month and a half, finally happened. So I think when you look at it for his perspective, obviously Lincoln Riley has built tons of skill positions, so they're going to be solid at the skill position perspective. However, they had one of the worst offensive lines maybe in the country, but specifically the Pac-12 last year. Couldn't stop anybody on defense. So we'll see. They haven't really added anyone from the offensive line perspective, so it'll be interesting to see what they look like, next year. But I think, the good thing for Oklahoma is here it really kind of solidifies. It was a gamble by Dylan Gabriel, knowing that there's a potential, not necessarily a high probability, but there was a potential for Caleb Williams to come back. There was a potential for Jackson Dart to come to Oklahoma. So I think when you look at those two kids, and the possibility, him willing to battle it out against those kids, and him willing to basically just say, okay, I'm going to take this gamble. I want to come to the University of Oklahoma, play for Jeff Lebby and Brent Venables. But at the end of the day, it was a gamble that paid off for him. So he's very much the clear-cut guy coming into to 2022 for Oklahoma. Obviously, there won't be much. I mean, I know that they probably won't give obviously they're not going to give the job to him to start with, but he won't have a whole lot of competition. So it'll be him. He's got a couple of years if he chooses to use those to come or to stay at Oklahoma. So it'll be interesting. And a lot of people point out the last time Oklahoma has actually had a left-handed quarterback, they won the national championship. So I don't know if there's anything to that, but there is I think a lot of excitement. I think a lot of people started to learn a little bit more about Dylan Gabriel as as the process kind of went through, and then knowing that he might be the QB1 there for Oklahoma, but he's a guy. Um, he's an incredible competitor. Watching him at UCF, doesn't have the best feet in the world, but can be a threat to run, which is obviously going to be needed in Jeff Levy's offense. But who's a guy, he throws a really good deep ball. I think one of the things probably is his biggest area of improvement. Not that it's bad, but completion percentage has not always been as high as it really needs to be. I think a lot of times he's been in the low 60s. You'd like him to be probably in the mid to high 60s from a completion percentage perspective. But it's got some time to obviously work that out, and was much better this year before his injury, and just kind of that intermediate passing game as well. So I think Oklahoma's in good shape with him.
Folks, your business could benefit from sponsoring us here at the Voice of College Football OU. Certainly hit me up at MarkRogersTV at Gmail if you own a business or are connected to a business that could benefit. I could lay out for you exactly what we can provide for you in terms of a sponsorship and all the various numbers and metrics, so you know how many people you would be reaching and how effectively here at the Voice of College Football. So again, hit me up at MarkRogersTV at Gmail. Do we have a date, Jason, on when spring practice starts?
I've not seen a date yet, Mark. I would anticipate that probably coming out here in the middle, in the middle of this month at least. I think it's interesting. Venables in terms of his strategy with players, and I think so I think in strategy with players in terms of media availability and stuff like that, when we start talking to some of these kids, is the whole Spaces situation with Twitter is gaining tons and tons of steam, and there's been some spaces where some of the Oklahoma players have been part of that, but Venables has immediately shut that down, and no availability right now. So haven't really heard anything either from a player perspective or from a coaching perspective on when spring practice will begin. But like I said, I would anticipate it getting something either by the middle towards the end of this month, because it'll get started in March at some point, and then you probably would assume your spring game is kind of early April, maybe closer, maybe mid-April, but somewhere in that time frame.
So, folks, we are just about 5 or 6 weeks away from spring practice. So we'll be previewing positions and getting you set for spring practice, and of course gathering all the information and the spring practice notes as they become available, and we know what's going on there in camp as we get to spring practice. So that becomes an exciting time of year. And so Jason, just going into spring practice, do you have a thought about what intrigues you the most? What do you have the most questions about? What you think needs sorted out the most on either side of the ball?
Everything.
Yeah.
I think Mark, I think it's very I've kind of remarked to a couple of people that I know, that we kind of share some information and talk about Oklahoma football, and I think it's interesting because I think this will be probably the most anticipated spring game that Oklahoma has had in quite some time, because when you look at it, it's a complete turnover, right? When you look, completely new offensive scheme, completely new defensive scheme. Everything's new on the defensive side of the ball, from a coaching perspective, right? Based on what they've had in the past. You're breaking in a new quarterback. You've got a lot of new players. We talked about the number of people that have left, number of new people. You're in the 30s, you're in the mid 30s of new roster kids. So I think there's a lot of intrigue. There's a lot of stuff that you don't really get a good feel and a good opportunity to to see in a spring game because of the how they protect the kids and stuff like that, which is needed. So obviously, I think first and foremost, the biggest interest really overall is seeing the quarterback. The quarterback play is obviously the biggest interest. I think for me, what is interesting is just looking is just looking to see from a body type perspective. One of the things we've talked about a lot for Oklahoma is they've not been as big specifically on the offensive defensive lines as they've needed to, and there's already been horror stories about Jerry Schmidt from some of these kids that have and they haven't even gotten to any of the hard stuff yet. So I think it's going to be interesting to see what does the evolution of some of these kids' bodies look like. Obviously, it's not a lot of time, and there'll be more time in through the summer and stuff like that to what they look like in fall. So, I think that's really interesting. What they look like up front, like I said, the three biggest areas of concern that I've had from this team last year and then coming up, and just to see how much they can improve the offensive line, the defensive line, and then the secondary. I think Oklahoma's done a really good job, all three areas, making improvements to the roster. They've added transfer portal kids. They've added kids through um, you know, through the recruiting cycle as well at those, and I think they like their numbers there. Just will be interesting to see what that looks like out on the field. So I'm really looking forward to this period here between what we have now on signing day and then when spring practice, just to start looking at some of that and breaking some of that down, even from position by position, just to see what that looks like. Linebacker position is really something that's very intriguing to me as well. Oklahoma wasn't necessarily horrible at the linebacker position last year, but they've lost Nick Benito, they've lost the other line, Brian Asamoah, and so they've added those. They've added a lot of young kids there into the mix. So it'll be interesting to see what that lineup looks like, and what kids are emerging as kids that can really challenge for starting spots and going to add depth, and what that looks like.
Yeah, Ron Brown here, I assume is an Oklahoma fan because he refers to the way he refers to the team. But boy, he's looking at a dire recruiting forecast here. This class is what you're going to see going forward. Recruiting battles with Kansas State, Iowa State, Tulsa, Texas Tech will not work. I'm not seeing that.
No, I don't either. Mark, I think what Oklahoma will be. They'll recruit. I mean, think about when you think about this on how everything happened, and Oklahoma slid. They were probably top 5, 6, 7 recruiting class, and they slid all the way to 19th. And to be able to rally that to the 7th, yeah. I mean, to Ron's point, there's a couple of kids that they flipped from Iowa State. They're looking to try to flip from Iowa State. There's a couple of other kids that they're in battles with teams that you wouldn't necessarily expect. But I absolutely don't think that's going to be a thing of the future. Oklahoma has so many dynamic recruiters on this staff. When you talk about Brent Venables himself, when you talk about Cale Gundy, Jeff Lebby doesn't really get a ton of notoriety from a recruiting perspective, but in the short time that he's been here, he's got 3 quarterbacks that has been able to come that he's got commitments from. Obviously, Jackson Arnold is the 2023 kid, but with Dylan Gabriel and then Nick Evers here in this 2022 cycle, he's done a phenomenal job. Talked about Cale Gundy, DeMarco Murray's has turned into a really great recruiter. And then you talk about all the guys on the defensive staff. We talk about Jay Valai. You talk about even Miguel Chavis, who's a new guy, but he's done a good job. So I think Oklahoma is probably in a better position recruiting than they've been in quite some time. Obviously, Oklahoma was much, much better under Lincoln Riley, and there was a renewed emphasis on just what it takes to recruit at a high level, and they've done that. And I wouldn't think anything other than that same trajectory will still will still move forward. I'll say, but it'll even be better. But I will say the thing that's going to continue to haunt Oklahoma is playoff success. They've got to be in a position where they've at least won a playoff game, if not a national championship. That will just, they've recruited so well without that. And obviously, we know there's only a few teams that are winning playoff games and winning national championships and stuff like that, right? So, but I think Oklahoma needs to be in that position, and they may be in this position next year, Mark. I think early on we thought, yeah, this might be a little bit of a rebuilding year, maybe a 8-4, 9-3 season. But I think Oklahoma has the team in place and has the depth in place at these key positions. If it materializes, I think the way that some of us think that it might, that they have every opportunity to challenge for a Big 12 championship this next year. And then, obviously, if you win a Big 12 championship, you're in the driver's seat to, depending on how the season goes, obviously, but you're in the driver's seat to be able to make one of those playoff games. So I think that would be just a huge success story for Oklahoma if they come back and they're able to win a Big 12 championship, which you have to think that Oklahoma's, right there, Oklahoma, Baylor, Texas. To a certain degree, those are the three probably favorites coming in, and I know that we'll talk about this a ton, but I think that's the next part. They will recruit well based on what some of these defensive coaches have done, their history of success at other programs that they've been, and feel like that they're able to sell that to some of these kids. So I see that continuing and even getting better.
Christopher says eventually there are going to be fewer teams that are legitimate title contenders. I don't know how more few or less that we can whittle this down to. I think we're around 5 right now. So
yeah, no, you're absolutely right. I mean, it was good. I think that we got a couple of new teams in here, but neither one of them were remotely competitive. So it's still I guess Cincinnati kind of was, but neither team had. I mean, you could tell early on neither team had any opportunity to win either one of those games. So, no, I think it's the opposite. We need to have more, and I don't think we're in a position to have to have fewer. To your point, it's about 5 or 6. You can even stretch to say 6. Alabama, Georgia, Clemson, LSU. Those are the typical people, and really Alabama and Georgia has been the 2 teams over the last few years.
Yeah, and even that Alabama-Cincinnati game that stayed within 3 touchdowns, you just had, at least I had the perspective on it that Alabama was just kind of punching the clock. They just looked like they were punching the clock and putting their time in, and they were just going to kind of control the game, not look to do anything too strenuous, and then get to the Georgia game. So who knows what that score could have been. Shoot, now I forget where I was going to go with this because I had one other direction to go. Somebody had said something that led me to take this in a direction, and now, shoot, I lost my train of thought. Well, we will let everyone know that we're here every Wednesday at 11:30 Central Time. And please be here for the live edition. That's when we want you here so we can get your comments and your questions. But if not, we obviously record this. So it is here for the rest of the week. We appreciate OU Yardbird that Al has sent the stream out there on social media. Appreciate that so much.
Yeah, to give you a little bit of I just noticed that as well. Give you a little bit of feedback. He has been he's been a guy. Al Ashback has been a local radio guy for for Oklahoma, in the state of Oklahoma
Oh,
for
okay.
50 years. So
Wow.
he's very, very well known among the national media. So that's really, really cool. Al, if you're watching, thanks for the share.
Thank you so much for that, Al. I had no idea. I appreciate that. We appreciate that so much. When I know this is just a flat out guess, but we are 6 to 7 months away from the 22 season. We know that there's a commitment between Oklahoma and Texas and the SEC. Is there any more conversation out there about when this is going to take place and when these schools are going to start competing on the field?
It's been, Mark, it's been almost radio silent since the initial announcement. There's been some things that have came out. I mean, given the fact that both the Big 12 and I think the SEC has to this point, but I know the Big 12 has put out their schedule, obviously the Big 12 schedule for next year. So I would think that they have everyone's pretty confident, I think, at this point that that Oklahoma and Texas will be Big 12 members in 2022. Some of the things that I've heard behind the scenes is I think that Oklahoma really is very interested in moving in 2023. I think that's the year, that Oklahoma looks to, and Texas look to be there, because I think it's a little bit of a weird situation, Mark, with Oklahoma, potentially, because being in the Big 12 even in 2023, because the new additions to the Big 12 have been announced, and they're talking about some of those scheduling stuff for 2023, and potentially how they're going to, how those divisions are going to line up. You would think that, both mutually between Oklahoma and Texas in the Big 12, there's not a whole lot of interest in setting up divisions and matchups for two schools that are only going to be there for a year at the most. So I would think if there's some obviously behind the scenes stuff, in terms of, there's some probably litigation that's going on, just in terms of the early out clause and the in the TV contracts and all that stuff. So I think, in the grant of rights situation. So I think there's some stuff that obviously needs to be worked out, and I think, in between Oklahoma and between Texas, I think they'll be willing to pay some of that money, but I think they weren't necessarily looking at, paying that $70+ million that was going to be required. So yeah, haven't heard anything distinct, but I think all signs for me would point towards that 2023 season.
Just to let everyone know, if there's an individual that I put in timeout for about 5 minutes, they are slandering somebody in particular, so we're not going to tolerate that. So what is your perspective, Jason, on the Big 12 going forward with the 2 losses, but the 4 additions, which I consider to be about as good as that they could have possibly done, to acquire Houston, BYU, Cincinnati, and UCF, and they tried to make up for some of the quality loss with some more quantity.
Yeah, I mean, obviously it's not as powerful of a league without Oklahoma and Texas, but I think, kind of the direction that you're going with this, Mark, is that I think it's about as good as the Big 12 probably could have hoped for, given the fact you've got some you've got a national brand like BYU, there, and then you kind of mentioned the other schools as well. Is, I liken it to, to a little bit of a higher quality American conference, right? So you've got, you don't have a lot of typical blue bloods still in that conference, but you have a conference that's going to be, very competitive. Specifically, when you look at exactly how much improved Oklahoma State has been, over over the last 10, 15 years, specifically the last 3 or 4 years, they've started to churn out a couple of double-digit win seasons in a row, and so and then you've got Iowa State that has become a much better program. So I think it's as good as they could have expected. Is it a good enough league to have a potential automatic qualifier type of situation into the college football playoff? No, it's definitely not. But I think it's if I'm a Big 12 person, I'm still probably pretty excited that where they have landed based on what happened with Oklahoma and Texas.
To run the numbers on the performance of those 4 schools against Power 5 teams over the last 5 years, they have fared well. They have fared reasonably well. I'm not talking about domination. I'm talking about they have been competitive with Power 5 teams. I've looked at the last 5 years for those schools and then try to put it into the context of, okay, how good are those Power 5 teams? And I think that if we continue on this same trend line, of course, Cincinnati's playing at an all-time high for that program. I don't know if they can maintain this. They're going to have certain recruiting advantages or benefits being in the Big 12 that they didn't possess before. And I think Houston in particular can certainly sell the Big 12 because they've got arguably the greatest wealth of high school football talent within 20 or 30 miles of downtown than just about anywhere in America. So maybe they can capitalize upon being in the Big 12 as well. But the thing is that it's not upper echelon ability or upper echelon. I think it's going to be, just to your point, an extremely competitive conference. It's like they added 4 TCUs,
right,
4 Kansas States. And again, I know people are going to go to the extremes and say, well, Cincinnati was really good this last year. Yes, they were. They were better than the teams I just cited this year.
mm-hmm.
But over the course of time, I think they pretty much added 4 teams that would generally go 7-5 a lot in a Power 5 conference and 500 in the conference, and certainly not embarrassing or in any such way, but it's not going to bolster the league from a playoff standpoint. It's going to be competitive to watch, and we're not going to know who's going to win the games from week to week. I don't know if it's going to put the league in a place where it's going to compete in a better sense toward a national championship or playoff appearances, though.
Yeah, no, you're right, Mark, and I think it'll be interesting to see when when the playoff expansion gets done, because it's going to get done. It's just a matter of when. Interestingly enough, looks like it's the ACC that's kind of holding it up, which is very bizarre in nature. Just the ACC seems to be, to me, that would be the last. The last league aside maybe the Pac-12 that would be against expansion. But I think whenever right now the way the league, the way the playoff situation works right now, I mean, you're not going to, aside from a situation that Cincinnati had this year, an undefeated regular season. So if you're Oklahoma State and you're undefeated and you win a Big 12 championship game, you probably have a pretty decent chance. If you're Iowa State, but now if you're Houston, if you're another one of these schools, BYU's an exception as well. They'll probably be in there. So I think that will be interesting to see if there's no expansion here, which it doesn't look like ahead of the 2023 season, what that looks like, because what the respect or lack thereof of the Big 12 happens if Oklahoma and Texas do indeed move to the SEC in 2023, what that might potentially look like, whereas you had a lot of respect for the Big 12 with what Oklahoma's been able to do, and maybe even to a certain degree Texas, kind of based on their name. What does that what does that respect look like moving forward? Is it a Cincinnati situation in which you have to have kind of a perfect storm in order to make the playoffs, or is it, somewhere in between, not necessarily a perfect storm, but not the same respect that the Big 12 had previously got?
Yeah, Texas certainly is going to have to up its game considerably to compete in the SEC. They were a mess for most of last year. And the Big Ten, they announced just a few weeks ago that they are considering eliminating divisions, and they've reworked the schedule for this season coming up that had some very slight changes to it that seem to be in favor of some of their power teams. And then they are also talking about and have been upfront about not just eliminating the divisions, but reducing their conference schedule from 9 to 8 games.
And I think that's the way some of these other schools are not schools, other conferences are going, getting away from the 9 game conference schedule and going to an 8 game schedule. And I think one of the things that we talked about on the onset of the SEC news would be what does that look like for a division, or I think the one thing that I've heard more that I think what's going to actually happen is more of kind of a pod situation. And I think the thing that I've heard a lot of noise about lately, not necessarily when Oklahoma and Texas will join the SEC, but how that's going to happen is in terms of what the scheduling looks like. I've heard a lot of noise, Mark. I don't know, maybe you've heard something about this as well, but with the 4 different pod systems that the SEC may indeed move to a 2-weekend SEC championship where you have sort of a semifinal game between Pod 1 and Pod 2, and then a semifinal game between 3 and 4, and then you come back for a one the next weekend, or maybe a couple of weekends after that. So I think when you think about that, there's a lot of things that kind of come to the forefront when you think about that. Money would be fantastic. Obviously, the SEC is obviously already the premier conference. You throw in 2 semifinal games on one weekend and a championship game, the money will be absolutely through the roof. But how do the coaches and players feel about that, having to play? You're already playing one extra game. Do you want to play a second extra game on top of understanding in the future there could be upwards of 3 or 4 games to win a national championship? I think that's going to be something interesting to see if what actually happens, and how they determine if it's not a semifinal situation, how they determine who's in each pod, and how they play for an SEC championship.
I would think the way to take that and make it workable, and to your point, they're playing so much more football that the regular season would have to be reduced.
Mm-hmm.
That if you reduce the regular season considerably, let's say by 2 games, because not only is there going to be an expanded playoff format within the conference, but a possible 12 to 16 team, probably a 12 team, possibly the 12 was proposed for an 8 team. Regardless, about 3 games required to win a national championship. So, of course, you're in your SEC playoff to get to the national playoff to win the championship. So if you're looking at having to play 5 additional games after the regular season, well, I would think you knock games off the regular season, and then you do what the Big Ten, I'm trying to think if the Pac-12 did this. I think the Pac-12 did it as well. I think you just knock 2 games off the regular season minimum, and then on the SEC playoff weekends, you have the other teams play, and you base it on seedings, and they play games. And I think that keeps the interest of, let's say it's the first weekend and you've got 4 teams. So you've got Oklahoma, LSU, Alabama, and Texas A&M playing in the playoff in the SEC semifinals, and then you see the rest of the teams, and it becomes kind of a interesting series of matchups between Tennessee and Texas and Mississippi State and Missouri, whomever. Anyway, I think there's an amount of intrigue if you can play those games in such a way that leads into the semifinals. Now, when you're talking semifinals and not just a conference championship game like we had with the Big Ten and the Pac-12 in the COVID year, then it's kind of tough to fit in other games that kind of work as you got too many games and you're not going to play games in your conference opposite the conference championship game. So I guess that would need to be worked out. Maybe play some Friday games. I don't know.
Yeah.
But I thought that was interesting to do it that way, to keep those fan bases interested, to give them a kind of a wild card game of, okay, we're not going to know until the last game of the regular season who we're going to play next week.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, you're right. I think it's going to be very, very interesting to see the changes within just the schedule, the 12-game schedule. The prospect of playing an additional 3 or 4 games. Does that cause teams to shorten their conference schedule? To your point, or does it? What does it do to the schedule? What does it do to the non-conference scheduling? Like, a lot of those things are going to be interesting to see what that format ends up being. And I think, obviously, I think the hesitancy from some of the conference commissioners has been just the kind of the flood of realignment that Oklahoma and Texas kind of started here. So once that settles down, I think you'll probably get more of a solid chance of understanding what the playoff situation might be. But I think there's definitely going to be a lot of changes on how conferences and how what the scheduling strategy actually looks like. So it'll be very interesting to watch. And I think I think we're all in agreement, whether you're for it or whether you're against it. It's going to happen here at some point. But I think to one of the comments that we had earlier, Mark, whereas getting fewer teams there, I mean, at the very least, it gives the opportunity to have more teams to have an opportunity. Not necessarily saying that the Final Four teams in the games will be more competitive than they've been in the past. That's obviously not necessarily the case, but you've got teams that get hot at the right time, and so they've lost a game or two early on in the year, and they don't have an opportunity to play in that game. And now it gives them the opportunity, and then I think we'll see a lot more competitive quarterfinal games, or of the first 12 teams that are in those first 3 or 4 games. I think will be much more competitive than what we've historically seen from these Final Four games.
Christopher calls the show on a regular basis. He's got an interesting playoff system in which he would like to see. So he has a playoff system in which you have 6 teams, and then they play each other. So they play down to 3, and then you just airlift the FCS champion into the Final Four and drop them in as the 4 seed or whatever seed they would be as the FCS champion, and they would take on the other 3. I've told him that it's an interesting concept. I would be intrigued to watch it, but I don't know how long I would be intrigued after the first game ended 62-7. But you're talking about a completely different level of football, and I understand where he's going. He wants it to be proven, and he also wants there to be a true national champion over all of college football. So that's a concept right there that he has in particular.
Interesting. Yeah, I mean, it can go a lot of different ways. I mean, it's going to go a lot of different ways. I mean, so I'm excited for it. I know there's a lot of people that don't like the that like everything the way it is, and some people even want to. I mean, everybody has an opinion. Some people even want to go back to the way it was from a BCS perspective. So yeah, it'll be there's no shortage of opinions, but it'll be interesting. I think it'll be better for the game to have a more expanded situation from a playoff perspective, just because giving more teams opportunities. We've talked about this. When you have four teams out of 100 plus that even have an opportunity to play for a championship, it just levels the playing field a little bit, in my opinion.
Christopher is asking 62-7. I made a mistake, Christopher. I meant 62-3. 62-3. Yeah. So you're just talking about just two different levels of football entirely. All right. Well, we appreciate everybody being here for our weekly Oklahoma show. Hopefully you can make it back here next Wednesday at 12:30 Eastern, 11:30 Central. And again, please subscribe, hit the like button, hit the bell for the notifications to know for sure when we go live. All right, Jason, anything else? I guess we're waiting for some signings today.
Yeah, I haven't heard any. I'm still trying to, just trying to keep my eye out. I have not heard anything yet on anyone, but hopefully we will start hearing some stuff this afternoon. I know that I saw that Texas A&M got another big time defensive line commit here this morning. So they are, between Texas and Texas A&M, both of those teams, they have some very, very high expectations to live up to here in 2022, specifically Texas A&M, because of the one of, if not the best recruiting class in history, which seems to get broken almost every single year. So maybe it's just one of those things that will continue to happen. But my gosh, with the talent that they have bringing in, and they've brought in this year, and the talent level that's been that's gotten better under Jimbo Fisher. They've got a lot of pressure on them, but there's still a little school in Tuscaloosa that might have a little bit to say about that.
Yeah, your rankings at the top, and this should be pretty close to the way it lands because there's not too many more out there to be signed. Texas A&M 1, Alabama 2, Georgia 3, Ohio State 4, Texas 5, Penn State 6, Notre Dame, Michigan, North Carolina at number 9, and Oklahoma at 10. So nothing too shocking out of certainly that top 5 in particular. All right, Jason. Well, we appreciate you being here as always, making this work and making this happen. And we would invite everyone to head on over to Last Word on College Football and check out Jason and everyone else's work on college football. All right, Jason.
All right.
Well, you have a great week.
All right, you too. Thank you, sir.
We'll catch everybody soon. We've got a 5 o'clock Michigan show, 6 o'clock Florida State, and 7 Miami. And we will see you back here next Wednesday.
All right. Thanks.